Good day and welcome to another video presentation done by the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library in Denver, Colorado. Today we're going to take a look at collecting the stamps and the postal history of the Portuguese colonies. As a way of introduction, why would one collect these stamps? There are many reasons. They are interesting, they are attractive, they're affordable, they're usually easy to find, they're educational, and not as many people collect them. Many people collect British, French, German, Italian colonies, but not that many collect the Portuguese area. If you're wondering about the triangle stamps that you see at the bottom, those are here to help develop your interest in these colonial stamps. Our next question would be, where are the colonies? When did they issue stamps? Here on this particular slide, you will see a number of colonial stamps, from some of them of topical interest, some of them presenting monarchs or regattas. First, let's look at what the colonies are. Where are they? When did they issue their stamps? And here we will group the colonies together by their locations. There are and were colonies in the Atlantic Ocean, there were colonies in Africa, and greatly spread out, there were several colonies in Asia. And again, we have a couple of triangular stamps down at the bottom to help pique your interest, shall we say. First, let's look at the Atlantic colonies and their issues. The Atlantic colonies were two island groups that are actually still part of Portugal today. There are semi-autonomous regions. The two island groups are identified, but first we'll see where Portugal is at the far southwest corner of the European continent. It's in the dark green. The lighter green are nations of the European Union, and then the gray are other European nations. At the very bottom, you'll see an arrow pointing to the island group of Madeira. Madeira is known for the red wine of the same name. Grapes are grown on the island. Today, tourism is a large part of Madeira's economy, along with the wineries. Madeira itself is by far the largest of these islands. The capital city is Funchal. The Azores, inside the circle, are located farther out in the Atlantic with several large islands. The Azores were an important base for the United States during World War II. Portugal was neutral in the war, but leased part of the main airfield to the U.S. to do rescue efforts for ships that were torpedoed at sea by German submarines. Fishing is still a major industry in the Azores, as long as tourism. Some people immigrated from the islands in the 19th century to New England, where fishing was also important. There was much communication between New England and the islands, and we'll show you a piece of postal history momentarily. And here's that piece of postal history. This is also called a cover, but most collectors will already know that. In 1900, there wasn't always a direct route for mail, so this letter went to Lisbon, then to New York City, and finally arriving in New Bedford, its destination. The stamps on the envelopes say Angra, not Azores. For a while in the 1890s and 1900s, several cities in these islands issued their own stamps, in addition to stamps inscribed Azores and Madeira. And samples of those stamps are shown at the bottom. In 1980, both areas, as semi-autonomous regions of Portugal, began to issue their own stamps again. You see one for the Azores on the left and one for Madeira on the right. Next, we'll take a look at the African colonies, and they're rather spread out but easily identifiable. In the upper left, you'll see an arrow that's actually pointing away from the map. That's pointing to the Cape Verde Islands, Cabo Verde. Again, it's a group of islands where fishing is part of the economy, And there's a lot of people who move back and forth between Cabo Verde and Portugal, even though the islands are independent. A very well-known jazz and pop singer, the late Cesaria Evora, came from the Cabo Verde, from the Cape Verde Islands. These territories first came into existence with sea voyages done by the Portuguese shortly after the taking of Constantinople, the capital of the Roman Empire, by the Ottoman Turks in the year 1453. The Turks created a barrier that closed off the old trade routes to Central Asia and India. Think about Marco Polo here. And the Portuguese were determined to find a way to the Far East and culminated that effort in the arrival of Vasco da Gama in India in 1497. The presence in these colonies, other than Cabo Verde, began in the early 1500s, at least on the coastlines. We'll talk the territories a little more in detail a bit later on. And we've already mentioned Cape Verde, and I alternate with both the Portuguese name and the English name for the islands. Next is Portuguese Guinea, and it's on the mainland of Africa. You see the arrow pointing to it. It's very small. When it became independent in 1974, because there is a neighboring country then of French Guinea, which became Guinea when it obtained independence, Portuguese Guinea named itself Guinea-Bissau after its capital city. Continuing around the west coast of Africa, one comes to a tiny island group of which the islands are St. Thomas and Prince, or in Portuguese, São Tomé and Ilha do Príncipe. These islands have just a small population and continue to enjoy a close relationship with Portugal. St. Thomas and Prince works and trades with other Portuguese-speaking countries like Brazil and Angola, along with the US and Germany. On the southwest coast, and it's not marked by an arrow because it's pretty big, you'll see the large country of Angola. Angola became independent in 1975 and dealt with a civil war for the first decade of independence. The country is very wealthy in natural resources, but there's great income inequality in the country. If you have sharp eyes, you'll see the small enclave of Cabinda north of the mouth of the Congo River. This is part of Angola as the former Portuguese Congo. And actually, I did have an arrow there for you. On the southeast coast of Africa, one will find Mozambique. It too experienced civil war after independence, and there is still an Islamic insurgency in the far north. In addition to belonging to the international group of Portuguese-speaking countries, the so-called Lusophone countries, Mozambique also belongs to the British Commonwealth. And this is in part because Portuguese Mozambique had a long history of engagement with the British due to providing seaports for British territories in the interior of Africa. Next, we'll take a look at the colonies in Asia. These are so far-flung that we need 3 different maps to show them. Here are the location of Portugal's former territories in India, occupied by India beginning in 1954 and concluding in December 1961. Goa is considered as one of the most prosperous states in all of India. Despite a size of only 1,500 square miles, it has tremendous biodiversity, mineral resources, and perhaps the best beaches in all of India that leads to an important tourism industry. Despite being a part of India for 60 years, the locals still value the Portuguese culture that remains. And despite Indian rule, the largest city in Goa still has a Portuguese name, Vasco da Gama, or Vasco for short. There's been little interest in changing the name. The 2 enclaves to the north with 2 arrows are Diu and Damao. They remain as territories of the Indian government due to their very small size. Each also has a limited tourist trade, and Diu enjoys a fishing industry. In the interior from Damao, one might see Dadra and Nagar Haveli. Those were interior territories that belonged to Portugal. Most used stamps of Portuguese India have cancels from towns in Goa. Clear cancels for Damao or Diu or other small villages up north are hard to find. Next, we'll take a quick look at Macau. Decades ago, if one blinked, one could miss Macau as it covers or then covered only 6 square miles. Infill and very shallow ocean water has doubled the size of the territory. Macau remained Portuguese until December 1999, when it reverted to China. Today, Macau is the most densely populated city in the world with 500,000 residents, but still has a good amount of green, open space. It's the only place in all of China where casino gambling is allowed. U.S. companies now make more money in Macau than they make in Las Vegas. Macau has a special 50-year arrangement as part of the agreement between China and Portugal to retain a special relationship. Macau is the only city in the world where you can find street signs in both Chinese and Portuguese. And this is an example of a street scene in Macau. I was there as your narrator in December of 2014 with friends from the Colorado Mountain Club. And if you look closely, you can see the sign that says Centro for Central Business District and also Chinese characters. You'll also find street signs in English in Macau because of its close proximity to Hong Kong. Finally, we'll take a look at Timor-Leste, or East Timor, in the eastern end of Indonesia, close to the island of New Guinea. Our arrow here gives us direction to Darwin, Australia, which is about 400 miles to the southeast. Timor was a backwater for many years. An agreement between Portugal and the Netherlands, which owned the rest of the East Indies, defined the border on the shared island in the 1800s. Despite Portugal's neutrality in World War II, it was occupied by Japan for, quote, its own protection. Rather than abandon the people, the Portuguese governor accepted a form of house arrest. Australian troops liberated the island in 1945. The governor, who was still there, accepted the surrender of the Japanese commander. Timor was moderately active with political groups in the lead up to decolonization, and it declared its independence in November 1975. Unfortunately, Indonesia invaded a month later and annexed the territory over the strenuous objections of Portugal. Guerrilla warfare followed in the mountains. Timor Island, the entire island, is very mountainous. For about a decade afterwards, this was done by the 2,500-person native army. While they were badly outnumbered, the army had been well-trained and equipped by Portugal. The United Nations continued to recognize Portugal as the rightful sovereign of Timor. Finally, in 1999, Indonesia allowed the people to vote in a plebiscite, and over 95% of the people voted for independence in an election that was overseen by Australia, New Zealand, and Portugal. The vote, as I said, was independence. For independence was overwhelming. Timor became the new nation of Timor-Leste in 2002. Now let's take a look at classic stamp issues of the Portuguese colonies. Here we have issues that begin at the beginning around 1868 to 1870, the issues of the crown, the Portuguese monarchy crowned, issues of King Luis, and two issues involving King Carlos. These were issued in virtually every colony, and one does need to be cautious. Some of the crown issues can be very expensive. All of those crown issues were extensively forged by Francois Fournier, among others. A very experienced collector, however, in the Portuguese area can easily identify the forged crowns because there are obvious telltales. Here are more classic issues starting in the late 19th century that commemorated the 400th anniversary of Vasco da Gama's arrival in India. Currency changes occurred in 2002, necessitating a surcharge of most existing issues. Some of these surcharges are very rare. Also, you'll see a few stamps that were issued with King Manuel starting around 1908 or 09. King Carlos and the Crown Prince were both assassinated in Lisbon in 1908 by anarchists, which brought in the brief reign of King Manuel. A bloodless revolution occurred in 1910, which led to overprinting older issues with the word Republica. And you can see examples of that at the bottom. In the early 20th century, issues were produced featuring the Roman goddess of agriculture, Ceres. Those issues came out between 1912 in Portugal and then through 1932 in the colonies. There was much confusion surrounding all of the overprinted Republic issues, and something new was issued. And this was the uniform issue featuring Ceres. This long-lived issue was a workhorse and lasted for almost 20 years. The Ceres issues are found in virtually all worldwide collections, and most fall into the affordable, meaning cheap, category. Because of that, they are often taken for granted. However, the issue does have its complexities, including over 300 different printing plate flaws that are identified to date. And because the stamps are bicolored, they had to run through the printing press twice. First with the stamp itself, then the denomination and the name of the country. And one can imagine with 2 runs through the printing press, some interesting varieties were created. The 1930s saw more issues replacing the first Ceres, some of them with other pictures of Ceres, another on the right in the middle showing Portugal reading a page of the epic poem, the Lusiads. And finally, the last major definitive issue common to all colonies was the Imperio issue, shown here with 2 regular postage issues and an airmail that came out in 1938 to 1939. Also, we'll mention in passing here at the bottom, in Mozambique, 2 private companies, mostly British-owned, had concessions to run several provinces and issued their own stamps. On the left, stamps from the Companhia do Naeza, and on the right, from the Mozambique Company. In the 20th century, beginning early on, there were supplemental stamp issues issued for a variety of purposes. At the top, you have airmail stamps. In the middle, postal tax stamps, or a form of charity stamps. Next, you have newspaper stamps, and down at the bottom, various overprints. And some of these overprints on regular stamps created postage due stamps. Now we'll look at the countries in general. For Angola, this is a 1963 cover that was mailed from Angola to Fort Collins, Colorado, and eventually forwarded to a new address in Denver. And examples of 20th century Angola stamps are at the bottom. For topical interest, there was an issue of bird stamps and an issue of animal stamps. Also on the right, an issue of map stamps. Here is Cabo Verde showing a number of varieties. On the upper right, the pink stamp was issued to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Universal Postal Union in 1949. Every Portuguese colony issued at least 1 stamp, and this is Cabo Verde's. I don't have a cover of Cabo Verde at the time I put this together, so there is a block of 4 1962 stamps commemorating the effort against mosquitoes and malaria. Next, we have a cover from Macau, a map of the colony before infill began at the bottom. Also a cover showing Chinese masks. There were covers used on the 2 small islands at the bottom, Taipa and Colonial, which are now connected by infill. Those are hard to find because very few people lived on those islands during most of the 20th century. And here we have a cover from the late 1940s showing a complete set of Mozambique airmails on a registered cover with some additional stamps at the bottom, including the topical interest fish stamp from the early 1950s, and also a Mozambique map stamp. Here we have Portuguese Guinea. Again, a cover going to Chicago from the colony. Down at the bottom, you'll notice a stamp from the late 1940s with a picture of U.S. President Ulysses S. Grant. During the early 1870s, there was a dispute between Britain and Portugal over ownership of some islands offshore from the mainland. President Grant was asked to arbitrate this disagreement. He considered all the evidence and rendered a decision in favor of Portugal, hence his being recognized on a Portuguese Guinea stamp. Here is a cover from Portuguese India in the late 1950s, addressed from Goa to Denver. The other stamps are typical of some of the Portuguese India issues. There's the obligatory map stamp, but also a church building and a mother with child charity stamp. The Catholic saint, St. Francis Xavier, is buried in a cathedral in Goa, and several stamps have been issued in front of the saint. Portuguese India stamps are a little bit different from stamps of the other colonies because they have a heavy Catholic religious overtone. And here we have a 1967 commercial cover sent from St. Thomas to Stockholm, Sweden, an unusual destination. Also, there was not a lot of industry on the islands because of low population. So this cover is not only uncommon because of its destination, it's uncommon for its general use. And again, some samples of St. Thomas and Prince stamps on the bottom. And finally, in terms of the colonies, here's a stamp from Timor that was sent in 1970 from a small village called Suai, it's spelled S-U-A-I, to Connecticut. Covers from that little village in the time period and before are uncommon. Most of the population of Timor then resides in cities on the north coast, including Dili, the capital. And again, some examples of mid-20th century issues from Timor, including the obligatory map. That's kind of a quick overview of the individual colonies. And so you might be asking now, well, thanks for all the information. I'm officially now a beginner. Where do I go from here? My first answer will be, congratulations, you are a beginner. You've started will hopefully be an interesting journey in collection of Portuguese colony stamps. What's going to be next for you? Well, you can become an intermediate collector or you become a specialized collector. And this is going to be completely up to you, the viewer of this video. There is no set outline, no guidelines on how you make this progression. It's how you view yourself and your collecting interests and the expertise that you gain. There are a couple of perhaps slightly advanced beginner options that you can do. One can be to collect stamps with clear cancels, either on or off paper. Portuguese colony postmarks can be notoriously bad. Look for obscure post offices like the St. Thomas and Prince Island stamp on the right that was used on the much smaller Prince Island. Because the series stamps are so small, it's hard to get a clear-cut cancel on just one stamp. So you may want to look at collecting 2 stamps, 3 stamps, 4 stamps, in other words, multiples. Another interesting area for you is to consider the native issues of Portuguese India. The first crown issues in India came out in the late 1870s. However, the colony began to issue stamps produced locally and more came out in the mid-70s and onward. There are 6 different sets recognized in the Scott catalog. The differences can be minute. Being advised that some of these numbers in the Scott catalog can be very expensive. And even some of the cheaper Scott numbers can still be very hard to find. One could say that collecting and specializing in these native issues is an acquired taste. But if you go that route, it's going to be a taste that I think you will find very rewarding. You might be saying, well, thanks for all the examples and suggestions, but where can I find Portuguese colony stamps? The first place I would recommend that you start out is with the American Philatelic Society. On their website, they have a listing of their stamp dealer members, and those can be found at www.stamps.org. And go through that dealer list, look for dealers who may specialize in worldwide stamps, and some may specifically issue, other than worldwide, what they offer. You can also buy collections from auction houses. Some of those auction houses are on the APS dealer list, or they may advertise in the monthly American Philatelist magazine produced by the APS. Review any Portuguese colonial collections that are found in auction catalogs. Review them carefully. Most will have either the Scott catalog value or an estimated price. Our suggestion is to watch auction catalogs for several auctions before bidding to get an idea of how the auction house operates. Be sure to read all the bidding rules, and all is in all caps here, all bidding rules. Be aware that collections may sell for higher or lower than the estimate or the catalog value given. After watching sales at a given auction house for a while, take a look at the prices realized that are posted online by these houses to get more information. Every person is different in how they collect. Your narrator became a beginner collector of Portuguese colonies in the 1970s. Again, remember, this is how you view yourself. There are no set guidelines. I became an intermediate collector by the late 1980s, and then I progressed to what I consider as a specialist in the 2000s. I began buying worldwide collections in the 1970s and 80s. My most recent purchases, however, have been Portuguese colony collections exclusively in 2022. And I've also, for many years, purchased specialty items from several dealers. I've listed 3 dealers here that I have found, for me at least, to be very good sources through many years of buying from them for the material that I want for my collections. Again, please be aware that what works for your narrator may not work for you. I like D&P Stamps in Chula Vista, California, Stamps and Postal History. I also use Filatelia Masinge. That's how that's pronounced, with the tilde and the cedilla. They're in Lisbon, Portugal. I've bought Stamps and Postal History from them. I've also bought collections over the years from Dr. Robert Friedman and Sons in Woodridge, Illinois. Again, I can't stress enough that what works for me may not work for you. You need to do your own research in this specialty area and develop what's going to satisfy you and works for you. We'll close out here by looking at a couple of catalogs. Where can you find information about Portuguese colony stamp values? Again, bear in mind that the values you will find in the Scott catalog are retail values. If you go to sell, the offer you will get from dealers will generally be only a percentage of the retail price. So the old story, you buy at retail, you sell at wholesale. Remember that dealers have to make a profit in order to stay in business. And so, as with any collectible, go into it with your eyes open and realize that for the most part, when you get ready to sell, you're not going to get full catalog price. Okay, this is the specialized catalog from Portugal for the Portuguese colonies. A copy of this current 2019 edition catalog is housed in the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library here in Denver. There's another copy in the American Philatelic Research Library in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, that is affiliated with the American Philatelic Society. I know those catalogs are there because I donated the copies to both libraries. Hopefully they haven't been swiped by now. but these are two very key references that you will want to have. A word about reading the Mundafil catalog. It's pretty easy to do. There is a little bit of English translation in the front that explains some key descriptions. I also work off of a very good Portuguese-English dictionary, but as a longtime collector, and since Mundafil is profusely illustrated, I can generally find out what I'm doing without much problem. Bear in mind that the Mundafil numbering system is different from Scott. So we'll wrap up here with some acknowledgements. Again, this video comes to you courtesy of the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library and the volunteer video team composed of Gary Withrow, Sergio Lugo, Joe Lanat. I also leave you with another reference, the International Society for Portuguese Philately, which is our US-based collecting society for these stamps. It's at portugalstamps.com. I also want to credit Dr. John Cross from California. He's the longtime editor of Portu Info, the quarterly journal of the ISPP. Finally, my name is Steve Banowski, your narrator and a philatelist specializing in Portugal and colonies, among other interests. And we'll leave you with one final cover, Going to Chicago. Thank you for your interest, and this will conclude this presentation.